All right. There's a band out there, an old band called the Grateful Dead. And one of the members of the band passed away recently, Bob Weir. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know much about the Grateful Dead. I'm not going to pretend to be a fan of the Grateful Dead. I am passionately indifferent about the Grateful Dead, but I did, you know what? I do my homework. I actually, on the way to work on Thursday, I actually listened to an hour's worth of the Grateful Dead, which I think was like two songs.
Yeah, I was going to say a Dark Star and what else? Yeah,
Yeah, Sweet Magnolia. No, that's the kind of sacrifice that I do for this show.
well, good for you. That's why we love you because you're not afraid to grow.
Exactly. So we're going to talk a bit about the Dead and Bob Weir, and in order to make this interesting and informative, or at least informed, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. We do have a guest, Matt Jones. He's our in-house Grateful Dead expert, and Mick, you are also a Dead fan, which is great. Why don't I just hand it off to you, and you start talking, and I will insert clever quips on the way.
Okay, define clever, David.
It's in the eye of the beholder. Am I right?
Yeah, Matt, good to have you. Thanks for being here. Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
sure. We certainly share a aficionado ship for the Grateful Dead. I saw them three times, I guess, in their original iteration, or the one that the famous one. So I wanted to ask you. I mean, like any big cultural institution like the Dead, I mean they covered a lot of bases, right? So they had the whole Deadhead movement out of the Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco. They had people following them, and then also what I wanted to talk to you also a little bit about was they were quite audiophiles in their own way, in that at least for professional live sound, they built this infamous beast called the Wall of Sound around the mid '70s. I know it was done with a lot of Macintosh amps, Macintosh audio from I think Binghamton. They're still a huge player, and Alembic, the folks from Alembic, and I think famous Owlsley, who had other roles in the band, which we won't talk about maybe. But I think all those guys got together and they built this huge modern-ish PA system that like the world had never seen. What are your thoughts about that?
It's pretty fascinating. I think that that's one of their enduring legacies is their commitment to live sound. And that started right away in the early days, with Owsley doing their sound, among other things, when he wasn't on the lam or or in prison. And then it took it to an extreme when they built the Wall of Sound, just because they kept feeling like playing these places that would have just subpar sound. That concert sound was pretty primitive back then in the '60s and into the early '70s even. And so you'd have, when you started to have acts, I think some of the first acts to start playing the hockey rinks like Madison Square Garden, the Spectrum, you had Cream and the Rolling Stones and Janis Joplin and people like that who could sell out these places, or they would put two or three bands on the bill. And the sound was still the sound from playing the theaters and stuff. And so it wasn't loud enough. It was muddy. It was terrible. Like when the Beatles played Shea Stadium, people will tell you you couldn't hear a damn thing, right? It was terrible. So the Dead, because of their bent, were very into the idea of better sound. And even though the Wall of Sound, with its infamous, I don't know how many Macintosh amps powered the thing. There's a famous story of when they played the Watkins Glen thing, that like a couple of the amps blew, and like one of the sound guys had to get in the helicopter, and they opened up, the guy at Macintosh in Binghamton opened up the place on the weekend to like, was loading them into a station wagon for them. I mean, it's to get the sound back online. Um, and obviously that Wall of Sound was too much and cost too much money, because they had to have two to leapfrog it, because they said it would take like all day to set it up, do a sound check, do the show, take all night to break it down. That's just not really feasible. So, but when they came back after the hiatus, they had lighter, better sound, and technology helped them get there. And a lot of people have said that they really drove modern concert sound in terms of it being more powerful, better clarity, so that that's really one of the residue of the Dead success is that they really spurred on improvements in live concert sound by their just demand for better.
Great, thank you. That's a great way of putting it. And it really is easy. I mean, a lot of these bands, especially from that era, they had such great ambitions that, it can kind of look like the Spinal Tap effect, like, oh my God, we're not going to build one wall of sound, we're going to have two, and they're going to leapfrog each other around the country.
Yeah. You would hear later, Phil Lesh would talk about it, how much he loved it, because it was like he had like they each had like their own stack of amps, so like each note on his bass had like a different stack. I mean, it's crazy. Someone once said, I read somewhere a quip, some deadhead said, if cocaine could build its own sound system, it would have been the Wall of Sound.
I think it did, actually. I think cocaine did build that.
I'm gonna put that on a t-shirt.
And for those listening who might not know, because this is a small sliver of a band that had a many decade history, it was just like you said, it was kind of a relatively short period, very infamous and famous for fans who loved it. But we're talking like 30, 40 foot high walls of sound. Like when you see pictures of this thing, your jaw's going to kind of drop, because they see these little people on stage standing there in these giant walls of these huge speakers. And just quickly, what you said, Matt, about the Beatles, I think, were their amps even mic'd?
Maybe, but I mean, it was like a really primitive PAs.
Or they had like other Vox, speaker towers, like as their kind of PA. It was like garbage. There was nothing. There was no audio infrastructure for that.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that I can't think of specifically. It might have been each one of the Beatles who later said, we might have kept touring if sound was better. And if we'd had the better sound that came along after we stopped touring, maybe we would have kept playing shows. But like, yeah, no, you hear bootlegs from, the Stones' first arena tour in '69, where they were playing the Garden and Oakland Coliseum and all this stuff, and they're at a phenomenal level. It's probably as good as the Rolling Stones ever were with Mick Taylor. But the sound is mediocre. It wasn't what it would be 20 years later or 10 years later.
Interesting.
They had huge problems, as you said, with the miking, I know, because they had to flip. They had to have like two mics out of phase or something wired together.
If you see pictures of it or video of them playing in '74, right, they've got these weird, it's like a twin thin microphone, and right, double mics so that one would be out of phase so there wouldn't be feedback, because I don't think there were monitors, right? It was like they were just, it's very bizarre.
Yeah, and there was huge problems with that, and like you said, all these other technical issues. But what I have heard, some of the audience recordings from that era and that tour, the better ones, the people who are really dedicated to capturing the band from the audience, you can hear how phenomenal it is compared to some of the audience recordings of like just a year earlier, or like before. Like it really. I can't think of which ones I've heard that really stood out to me, but I've heard a few that say, "Oh my God, if they could make a recording that sounded that good from the audience, like you could just imagine when it was on, I know it sounded incredible."
Yeah, I've had similar experiences, because you usually tend to seek out all these soundboard recordings for good reason. But then there's a couple audience recordings from that summer of '74 where it was the main tour they did with that wall of sound. And like, I know there's one from the Hollywood Bowl. That's an audience recording that is just phenomenally the clarity in the recording. And you're like, this is a 50-some-year-old audience, guys with a real, a recorder in the audience. And it's immaculate. It's really, and you get a sense of how that sound must have enveloped you and how clear it was.
Definitely a revelation. So what are your thoughts, maybe quick thoughts about Bob Weir himself, his music, his contribution? What did he mean to you?
Weir is a really interesting musician because he's really singular in his approach to playing rhythm guitar. He doesn't sound like any other rhythm guitarist, and he doesn't play like any other rhythm guitarist. And I think if you read interviews with Garcia, and he would say that initially it was sort of like, what the hell is this, and then realized what they could do together and why they were so perfectly suited to playing together. And that like Weir, one thing they say is he had really big hands and would use a lot of weird chordings. a lot of diminished and augmented chords and like these very unusual chord patterns. And he didn't do what a typical rock rhythm guitar player does, which is sort of strum, strum, strum. He was really looking to add color. And also, as he would define it, as my job is to intuit, because Phil Lesh is a very unconventional bass player. He wasn't, he was a guy who came out of classical and avant-garde music, and basically Jerry Garcia said, "You're going to learn to play the bass and be the bass player." And so he wasn't, as we call, a stay-at-home bass player. He was kind of playing like lead bass, the way the only guy I can think of similar. It's totally different, but similar in terms of what they did in their band sound is John Entwistle. Where it's just
Right.
he's playing lead lines on the bass all the time, and so you got Lesh on one side and Garcia on the other. And so Weir felt that his job was to try to intuit where they're going to go and fill in and make it make sense. So, I know I read an interview once where he said he was really inspired by McCoy Tyner. Listening to McCoy Tyner play with Coltrane, not that he was comparing himself to McCoy Tyner as a musician, but saying Tyner, when you listen to that Coltrane band, he was kind of laying out and waiting and sort of anticipating where he thought Train was going to go, and so he could fill in and or feed him a texture or a chord that would make sense. And so Weir was inspired by that and thought, that's my role in the Dead, is I've got to try to be there for Jerry and Phil, rather than just, I mean, sure, they could do a Chuck Berry and it would be, the typical, you're going to play Chuck Berry. You're not going to turn Chuck Berry into a raga. But for a lot of their stuff, that you can hear that that's really his role, that he's sort of adding color and sort of just supporting wherever it is Garcia wants to go.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it, and he did that fantastically. I mean, for anyone who's just a little bit curious about the Dead or anything, obviously it's a huge catalog to try to dip into. But if you do start listening to them and some of the live stuff, maybe 1974, I recommend 5/19/74 in Portland. That's one of my favorites. That China Rider is just insane. Try to listen out for Bobby and see what he was doing on the guitar, because like Nate's saying, it's really unique. It's really unique. I was a guitar player and I just scratch my head and tip my hat at the same time. Like, I don't know exactly what he's doing at all, but I've never heard anyone else play like him. He was a brilliant, brilliant, underrated guitar player.
I think that's absolutely true. And that's interesting you cite that show, because that's a favorite of mine as well. And that's what I always refer to. That's like the best jam out of trucking you'll ever hear. Like, because it gets to this very intense peak, but then it just wanders into weirdness, and then it's got this beautiful theme that he and Garcia play. That's this little guitar theme that has had various names over the years, because it's a recurring like little motif that they would come back to. Maybe not a lot, maybe 20 times in their history. If you listen to all these tapes. When I first found it, they called it the Heaven Help Jam. Now they call it something else, Mind Left Body Jam. But it's a great example of what Weir brought to the table.
And also shout out to Keith Godshaw, the pianist at that point, because what I really love about 74 is he just had that sweet spot where he was really in the band. He really got it. He really locked in with Jerry, and his interplay with Jerry and Phil and the rest of the band, I think is phenomenal as well in around that period. So, gosh, to have seen the Wall of Sound and the band at one of their multiple peaks. They had a lot of peaks.
You're talking about 30 years, right? And 30 years of where pretty much nearly every note was recorded, right? There's not a lot of missing shows. And I mean, maybe, more in the early days, but from pretty much like 68 on, it's like there's very few shows that there's no tape of, or there's very few. And so what's fun is, if you're a Dead fan, you listen to all these different eras, and they're all sort of different, and there's some different personnel in terms of keyboard players but it's always Garcia, Lesh, and Weir, and Bill Kreutzmann, and sometimes Mickey Hart, not, so and the various keyboard players. And so it's interesting the different character they have at different moments, even playing a lot of the same material. 1972 doesn't sound like 1978, which doesn't sound like 1983, which doesn't sound like 1990, but I think that that sort of period when Keith joins the band from late 71 until they hung it up for a while in late 74. I think that's sort of there's differences in those years, but I think that's when they were at their most creative live. I mean, really, at their, I think it's probably their peak as a live band.
I got a question for you guys.
Yes, sir.
This is David Jones. Hi. So the question I have is, um, so there were a lot of quote unquote bootleg recordings made. Now, the only experience that I have with bootleg recordings was from a show called What's Happening, where Rerun got in trouble for recording Doobie Brothers.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Now, from what I understood, that was a no-no. What was the working theory behind the Dead? Was it just like they're going to record it anyway, so you just like let them do it, or do you think there was some strategy behind it? Like, were they did they predict like social media 50 years ago?
That's a good question. I don't know that there was a plan initially. The idea of them anticipating social media isn't that crazy because that's the kind of guys they were. They were kind of these weirdo, semi-intellectual, artsy guys who thought about this kind of stuff. But I think the real reason people don't like bootlegging, especially back then, was people were just selling your stuff, and people would bootleg actual studio albums and put out inferior ones and throw them in stores. There's a film clip in the early 70s of Neil Young walking to a record store and finding bootleg Neil Young records and or showing them to the clerk and saying these are fake. And I think the Dead were less concerned about that and just felt like, well, our fans like recording the shows, and the fans weren't looking to make a buck. They were just trading tapes, and they just wanted to hear everything. Garcia had a famous quote where he said, well, once we've played a show, we're done with it. So it's yours. Do what you want with it.
Yeah, as long as there was no commercial motive or sales, it was tacit, and it took a number of years because I don't think they built the first or then they had a tapers section where you could actually buy a ticket and go into a designated, like, kind of roped off area sort of behind the sound man. So you'd sort of getting the sound man's mix of things. And that started around 84. But even before that, as long as you weren't doing it like commercially or making, trying to set up a huge, recording studio rig on the floor there, they just kind of tolerated it. And I think it was also anti-authoritarian. I think it was an FU to the record labels. They were notoriously cantankerous. Phil Lesh especially hated the record labels and everything to do with them. Rightfully so. He was a smart guy. And so I think it was also kind of like, hey, we're getting paid for the shows. We're traveling. These are our people, and we're gonna do something with our people. It was like it was a FUBU thing. I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I think right. I think after it had existed for a number of years, they had to be wise to the fact that it was this viral way of spreading their music for a band that wasn't getting a lot of airplay on the radio or wasn't having hit LPs, pretty much. I mean, they did have few, but it was like the word of mouth, right? So it was like, why is it that the Grateful Dead could go like 7 years without a studio record in the 80s and still be selling out 20,000 seat arenas all the time? And it was because it wasn't always the same people in a microbus driving show to show. Yeah, there certainly were those people, but there weren't 18,000 of them every night. That was a few hundred. So people would come. The Dead came to town, and people wanted to go see the Dead. Why? Well, my older brother had this tape that he got from a guy at school because he got, his buddy in the dorm had these tapes, or I went to summer camp and my counselor had these tapes, and that's how that music, the music really spread. You weren't getting it from turning on, the morning zoo radio or even most rock and roll stations. So you were getting it from, it was like, and that also became part of the fun, right? You were getting initiated into this, like, I don't want to call it a cult. I'm sure for some people they took it to that extreme.
I'll call it a cult. Yeah.
Hush now.
All right, I'm muted.
Well, yeah, no, but I mean, a cult tries to tell you what to do. The Grateful Dead never told you what to do. They wanted you to come to the concert, but Garcia was so anti-authoritarian to a fault, right? But I think it became right. You were part of the club. Everybody can listen to the top 5 bands, but it's like if you were a Deadhead and you found another Deadhead and you could talk like we're talking about, oh, 1974, man. What about that moment where they do this? It's just like it becomes more of a hobby than just listening to, everybody listens to the Beatles. Not that there's anything wrong with listening to the Beatles. The Grateful Dead listen to the Beatles, but if you listen to the Dead, it felt like, okay, it's like a secret handshake. It was that was sort of part of the fun of what got you involved.
You're listening to The Sound or Music with Mick and David Jones and Matt Jones. We will be back in 30 seconds.
Okay, Matt Jones, I got one last question for you, and then I can kick it back to you, Mr. David. Okay, Matt, this is to test your knowledge of Dead lore, okay? How many Deadheads does it take to change a light bulb?
I actually don't know that I've heard this one, so lay it on me.
1 to change the light bulb, and 100,000 to follow the old dead burned out light bulb around the country forever.
That's not bad.
Are you happy now, David? Did I diss the Dead to your satisfaction, sir?
That's marvelous. Thank you.
I do love that joke.
No, that's actually a.
Well, nobody likes busting on the Grateful Dead more than real Grateful Dead fans. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's very true. That's very true. So, Matt, let me ask you this. And Nick, am I doing myself a disservice by only listening to the studio albums? In other words, is it, it's like, yeah, I heard, what is it, Franklin's Tower? Is that a song?
Yeah, that's a song.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a great tune, but then I was like, well, is it better live? So that's my question. Is the Dead just better live?
Yes, but the thing is, it's such a daunting body of work, the live stuff, that you kind of need a Sherpa. You kind of need someone to sort of say, hey, what do you like? Oh, you like this? Well, you should check out, a couple, and they'll give you a couple of things to listen to, whether it's just snippets from shows or shows in their entirety. And then it's kind of like, and then once if you have a taste for it, then you can kind of just go crazy and dig in wherever you like. But it definitely, I came to the Dead as a teenager more through listening to Dylan, because Dylan was like, when I was like 13 or 14, he was like the first, I mean, sure, we all obviously the Beatles and the Stones, everybody liked the Beatles and the Stones, and I still do, but Dylan I sort of found and clicked with, and then that led to a lot of other bands and people that were sort of rooted in that sort of, as what's the Carlos Williams, deep in the American grain, which Dylan mined that, and then it turned out part of the reason why Dylan and Garcia loved each other so much was they were both guys who had probably spent a year of their life when they were 17 listening to the Anthology of American Folk Music over and over and over again.
Right.
So I had heard some acoustic Dead from 1970, and that just spoke to me, because I was like, oh, this is like, these guys are singing about, trains and all that kind of early 20th century stuff. And then I kind of took it from there. So it's kind of like where, if you didn't have the good fortune to have been dragged to a show, and either it was a great show and you loved it, or it was a bad show and you're like, why do you guys like this boring band? And there were both. I saw both.
Well, I got dragged to a Fish concert, and the dragger, he was basically like, well, look, man, if you like the Dead, you're gonna love Fish. And I said, well, I don't know if I like the Dead. I really haven't been exposed to them. But with Fish, by like 10:45, I was like, I got this. I got it. I understand. Thank you. I'm gonna get on the train now. Is there a lot of overlay between Fish fans and Grateful Dead fans, or is it like Boston and New York? Like you're just not one. You're just not both.
My experience, and I don't mean to jump on this before Mick gets a chance, is that I know a lot of guys who are big time Deadheads who love Fish, and then there are people like me who love the Dead, who Fish I've tried, it just is not for me. And part of it, and I've explained this to people, is I don't think that Fish have the songwriting chops that the Grateful Dead have. I don't think they have that connection to American roots music that the Dead had. The Dead were a bunch of guys that came out of playing folk coffee houses and listening to all of the stuff obsessively, and they know it back and they knew it backwards and forwards, and they could talk to you about Reverend Gary Davis or the Carter family or any of these sorts of pillars of American traditional music. And with Fish, it's like another generation down the line, and I think Fish they have great chops. They're terrific musicians. I just nothing about them compelled me to listen to them. And there's no doubt that the main affinity is that idea of you're going to go on the road with your friends and it's going to be a wild party and you're going to see and hear wild stuff, and a lot of people are going to be altered in some way by chemicals, either naturally occurring or found or made in a laboratory, and that's part of that experience for people. So I think that touring experience is similar, but to me the music is not that similar. But I get why there's overlap. I mean, Trey Anastasio, the Fish guitarist figurehead, is a Deadhead and loved Jerry Garcia and loved the Dead, and they're clearly an influence.
David, I just wanted to say, go. Oh, sorry, go. You go ahead, and then I'll jump in.
No, it's all right. I was just gonna say something stupid. Go ahead.
Oh, not you.
Obviously, you haven't heard the podcast.
here's here's the thing, that going back to your idea about the live versus the studio Dead. The we always talk as audiophiles. I know, it's like you and I both love our systems for listening, right? We sit, we get centered, we want to be in the sweet spot. We want to really listen to some of our recordings and really kind of, take them in and really like deeply appreciate them, right? By there. I don't think I think some of the studio stuff, you could definitely do that with the Dead if you're interested, just in hearing just some of their interesting musical ideas. Terrapin Station and Reckoning, the double live acoustic album from Radio City.
Touch of Grey, perhaps.
Well, maybe. But I think for the live stuff, Matt is totally right. You need a Sherpa. And I wish I had some cassettes still I could like loan you or dupe for you on my double tape deck, but I don't. But I would say pick a really great show, something like May 1977, Cornell, some of these iconic famous shows. And the best thing to do, I think, is just play it in the background while you are just doing other stuff, because it's kind of long. It goes on. It usually starts a little more rock and rollish. And then before you know it, you might find that your mind is wandering and suddenly you're hearing some really amazing extended improvisational jams and musical things, and you're like, wait, what happened? How did we get there? Like, wait, I don't remember like them starting this. So they just had a really seductive way of song into song, weaving and building on musical ideas. And they had certain transitions, segues that they did regularly between certain songs. But other times it was just kind of making up as they went along, because they could all communicate that way with looks and glances and little musical cues kind of just popping up out of the woodwork. So I think if you're able to just play it more in your environment while you're doing other stuff, that is where you might start to feel the live stuff more. That's just my opinion.
That's pretty good advice. For a lot of the time, for me, it was also driving. I would listen to tapes in my car, and if you were stuck like on a boring drive, and you weren't counting the minutes when you're like, how long are they playing this song for, and it segues into what? If you were, you just kind of let it go, and then you're kind of enjoying what they're. You find yourself, wow, a half hour's gone by, and I'm at the place I needed to be at, and that was pretty incredible. What did they just do?
Am I a jerk? Would I be ostracized by the Grateful Dead community for saying that I actually really like Touch of Grey?
No, I think
Is that a problem?
no. Everyone likes Touch of Grey. It's a good
It's
song.
awesome. It's a great
It's a
song.
really it is. It's really catchy. I mean, it just came up in title, and I was just like, oh yeah, no, yeah, Touch of Grey, and I'm like, yeah, I dig it, but I think that if I requested it at a Dead show, I would get stoned to death.
I will say this. No, you're wrong, and I'll tell you, because it had been in their live repertoire for 5 years almost by the time it was a hit.
Interesting.
I saw them after it was a hit, and they occasionally would open a show with it or play it as an encore. And when it was the opener, the place went nuts. Deadheads loved it. It was because it's also, for a band where a lot of the fans were a lot of similar in age to the Dead, so they were back in the '80s pushing 40, right? And it's kind of a funny, wry commentary on where you're at when you're heading into middle age, as we all know too well.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, you would not get any dirty looks for saying I love Touch of Grey. It's definitely a beloved song in the repertoire.
It was funny. There was a time when I was in college. I want to say sophomore year, so that would be 1990, and I think the Dead was touring in 1990. And there was a concert close by Ithaca. I just remember there was a whole fleet of women in our dorm who were going to go, and they were all your normal like New Jersey, Long Island crop of women, but that very day they all got dressed up in their tie-dyes and their bangles, and I was like, this isn't you. Is there, and I'm like, why don't you just dress up like you normally do, I guess.
Which is sort of how I went to Dead shows.
Wait, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to cut you up, but I was saying that you're absolutely right, because I was always the guy who was like, well, I'm going to dress the way I normally dress. Like maybe I'd wear a tie dye on occasion, but I was probably just there in like whatever I was wearing. I didn't, and I had my kind of square guy short hair, and nobody cared.
No, nobody cared. I just found it was interesting that a cultural phenomenon that I would guess would eschew the trappings of materialism. Their fans were all about dressing the part, and I just thought that was a little odd, especially when they didn't do it every single day. These were like preppy girls, athletic girls, whatever. And I just turn around, they're all whirling around in tie dyes.
Well, they were, it's like a little bit of tourism.
Yes, exactly. From what I understand, it was a very good show. Yeah.
You made me think, though, talking about Touch of Grey. I have to, because you'll enjoy this anecdote, because it's a Bob Weir story too. They were doing a press conference. I think it was when they were announcing in 1988, they played like 9 nights at Madison Square Garden. And the last night was this big benefit for the rainforest, with all these special guests, Hall and Oates and Suzanne Vega and Mick Taylor and a bunch of people that sat in with them. And so they're doing this press conference, and it was obviously, this was like a year after they'd finally had a mega chart hit with Touch of Grey and sold a lot of records, which was something that wasn't always easy for them. And they were, now playing big stadiums a lot, and they were making a lot of money. And so it's Garcia and Weir up on the dais, and they're asked. So someone asks, "Has success changed you?" And and Garcia says, "Yes, absolutely." As well, yeah, absolutely. And Bob Weir says, "The other night I was eating pistachios. You know those pistachios that are really hard to open? I don't bother with them anymore."
And I guess that shows the kind of guy he was. He kept things in perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the whole ethos of the Dead was there was no rigid expectations. There was no uniform. If those young ladies wanted to do that, they were probably just excited. They kind of wanted to like be a part of that movement or feel like some of it. That's totally cool. But yeah, I went to 3 of those shows, and I just wore whatever I had around. And most people were just in shorts and in like t-shirts and regular stuff. And yeah, tie-dyes were nice. It was a sign of like, hey, I'm dressing up for the Dead. I mean, I think that's kind of cute.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just like if you go to especially back then, you go to a heavy metal concert and everyone's dressed in heavy metal t-shirts and wearing their like spike, things, like the cliche things, because that's what teenagers and college kids do. It's like, David, you can remember, the halls of Schreiber when the Dead were doing a garden residency, and how many people suddenly were wearing hippie skirts and tie-dyes. The same thing.
Right, exactly. So in the remaining minutes that we have, can you encapsulate for me what the real cultural impact that the Dead had, not just on music, not just on technology, but I guess in fashion and in everything else. Like if the Dead wasn't around, if they were not the success that they were, how would what would the world look like?
That's a tough one to answer.
I'll just say, like, if I'll just recap it this way, as we've talked about today with Matt's great insights, they did, let's just, check off a few boxes. They did advance live sound and what was possible by building a hugely ambitious, state of the art, maybe overly state of the art PA system, which changed rock and roll. They changed completely the business model of it by proving that if you give it away, it comes back to you tenfold, which is what happened in their career by letting people just give their music to each other and not trying to not putting home taping is killing music stickers on everything. They broke the business like wide open in terms of like what was possible. They became viral. You talked about the social aspect, the network. That's part of that as well. Just like today, something online, internet goes viral, TikTok, this and that. They were doing that.
Right.
So would we not I'm not saying we have TikTok because of the Grateful Dead or that we have better sound, like certain types of sound things because of the Grateful Dead. I mean, yes, certainly for the bands we do, but it's they kind of their fashion. Yeah, they were part of a hippie movement where tie-dye became very popular, but I don't know. It's like they like a true cultural phenomenon. They really did touch on a lot of aspects of life and were very ahead of the curve in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and also the way artists interact with their audience, I think they really altered because you had fan clubs, right? In the 60s, you might have belonged to the Monkees fan club or even the Beatles, or the Rolling Stones. They had offices, but that was mainly like teenagers saying, send me a picture of Brian Jones, and no relation to
No relation.
No relation.
and the Dead they had a 1971 double live album just titled Grateful Dead. It has various other monikers, but the official title is just Grateful Dead. And they put a notice in there saying, Deadheads, who are you? Where are you? We want to hear from you, and with a mailing address. And the response was overwhelming. And so they ran that business in this kind of bizarre way, but they had this whole office and all these people that worked for them that were really treated as family and as almost as if they were band members. And a lot of their job was, they set up this alternate ticketing system where you would do mail order for shows and buy show tickets ahead of time directly through them rather than through the venue or through a ticket broker or a ticket sales agency. So real fans were doing the mail order and you could get really good seats and blah blah blah, and you had to mail away with a postal money order. Remember doing it when I was a teenager. So I think that, and I don't know if a lot of bands have picked up on that, but it did sort of anticipate what's happened, the way a band can communicate with its fan base via the internet in the last 30 years. That's really gone bananas. So I do think they were ahead of the curve in a lot of these ways of just, whether they saw it coming or they just out of a desire to do something different and to not be the same old sort of corporate structured entertainment behemoth. So they're, it just is like what we've been saying. Their cultural impact is so far reaching. So whether even if you can't stand the music or you hate what they stood for, you're feeling the effects of what they did to the music industry and to all these ripples through other various cultural and social areas.
Interesting. Well said. Were they anti-war? Did they get into the anti-war bit? I mean, because they were around during Vietnam.
They were kind of rigorously anti-political, except they did do benefits and stuff, but typically for, things like environmental causes or various specific things they got asked for, early days. I know they did like benefit for a Native American organization, stuff like that. But Garcia kind of always refused to speak about anything political. because he didn't want anybody just doing something because he said it, like that sort of thing. I think they were socially very conscious and interested in things like, the causes of the day, like, save the whales or nuclear disarmament or save the rainforest as it was in the 80s. So, but in terms of like being expressly political or saying like down with Nixon or vote for Carter, they really stayed away from anything like that. Maybe some of them in their personal life did stuff, but it was never. I think Garcia always expressed a fear of with they are kind of following it, sort of like, we just want to play your music because I don't want to be responsible for telling people what to do, and then 20,000 kids go out and do something because I said it's cool.
Right.
Well, who would do that? This has been really informative for me. Thank you guys. I really do appreciate the all the information. Matt, is there anything else that you would like to tell us about Bob Weir, about the Dead? Anything that we didn't go over?
No, and I worry that if we start anything up, it'll just, you could last all night. So it's
like a Dead jam session.
Exactly. Look at that. Look how you brought it all back home. Yeah, exactly. Just as I said, as Mick was saying, a phenomenal, underrated musician, a very interesting songwriter. With his wrote most of his songs with his buddy John Barlow, who died a few years ago, who was an interesting character in his own right. Very odd, interesting resume. They'd known each other since they were prep school buddies or something. He didn't often write with Robert Hunter, the main lyricist who Garcia wrote with exclusively. They wrote a few great songs together, but apparently not a great working relationship because they're both too difficult. So yeah, but I think that his songwriting and his musicianship can get overlooked. And there's no Grateful Dead without him. It wouldn't be the same thing. The whole push pull with Garcia is really what makes them their sound. With Lesh as well, I think.
Mick, is there anything else you would like to add to that?
No, not at all. Boy, I'm gonna go probably pop in my Sunshine Daydream DVD and go check out Veneta, Oregon tonight. I think that's what I'm going to be doing. Matt, it's been fantastic having you on. I really appreciate it, and it's great hearing your perspective. I learned some stuff, and I just really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me. It was great, a lot of fun. Always learning something.
So that's it, guys. Thank you for listening to this very special episode of The Sound or Music. Check us out on Spotify. Like us on YouTube. Subscribe, please. That would really be nice. Don't forget to clean your records. All right. Be well, guys.